We're just going to get started in a couple minutes as we allow other attendees to join. We're going to wait another couple minutes just to allow a few more people to join. Then we'll get started. All right, I think we're going to get going. So welcome to the webinar on what states should know, practical applications of blockchain and energy. Before we begin, one housekeeping item. Please submit your questions throughout the webinar in the chat box, and I'll try to incorporate them into the conversation or ask them at the end. And you can submit your questions by writing them in the question dialog box that's shown here on the right. With us today is David Livingston to help us explore one of the energy industry's most popular topics, blockchain. David is Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council and is lead author of a recent report, Applying Blockchain Technology to Electric Power Systems. Welcome, David. So let's get going.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. So blockchain has been getting a ton of interest with claims ranging from it's more revolutionary than the internet to it's just a scam. David, what was the impetus for writing the report and what did you hope it would accomplish?
Yeah, so first of all, I should give credit. The report was published by the Council on Foreign Relations through a collaboration I had with a researcher there. You know, the impetus was the report for was basically recognizing that there was increasing discussion of blockchain technology, but largely in very hyperbolic terms as it related to the energy sector. So you had a growing number of white papers being authored by startups in this space, making bold claims, mostly about how this technology, when applied to managing distributed energy resources or enabling household to household or peer-to-peer transactions of energy, would completely upend the way that the electricity sector works. On the other hand, you had others that were basically dismissing it as a fad, as something which was, you know, never going to pick up steam. And so there was clearly something here, something that had to be reconciled, and that both of these were probably untrue, and the truth was somewhere in the middle. But clearly, capital was starting to move into this space, and so there was some sign that there was also private sector interest. There were starting to be the first few investments made by incumbents like utilities into blockchain startup companies, or utilities joining consortia working on the intersection of blockchain and electricity markets. One of the best known ones in this space is the Energy Web Foundation, which was spun out from the Rocky Mountain Institute. In 2017, for example, startup companies raised over $300 million to work on different projects and initiatives that were based on applying blockchain to the electricity sector. And so we wrote this paper to try and add a little bit of order to the blockchain, to the chaos of blockchain mania, as we like to say. And so what we went about doing is saying, well, first of all, we need an empirical data set, because most of the white papers and most of the publications that are taking place in this space are based on one-off looks at a specific business model, a specific startup, a specific application of blockchain in the electricity sector. So why don't we create a broad survey of all the different initiatives by governments, by startups, by incumbents, by universities, by others that are taking place in this space, and look at what trends we could find. Where are they taking place? What are they mostly focused on? How much money have they raised, et cetera? It's possible that there were previously data sets on this, but none of them were publicly available. They all sat behind paywalls, if they existed at all. And so we thought that it would, at the very least, be a public service to try and create a open source, publicly available database of different initiatives in this sector. And then once we did that, I'll display to you some of the, later on in this webinar, I'll display to you some of the takeaways that we have from that grouping of different initiatives that we looked at. Once we had that, we also did a deep dive into 3 specific case studies of startups with pilot projects in very different markets, in fact, on different continents, you know, one coming out of the UK, another in Texas, another working on different markets in the US that are regulated very differently than Texas. And we did this to just kind of do a deeper dive and illustrate exactly how these initial forays into exploring blockchain and energy applications were looking to create a sustainable business model. And in many cases, more often than not, in fact, how those business models, as originally articulated by the startup, were quickly evolving over time as they ran up against the rocky shoals of regulation and the realities of energy markets in which they were trying to enter.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing as well. Before we start discussing the possible blockchain applications, can you tell us a little bit more about the blockchain technology, how it came to be, how it works, and what benefits there are?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get into the diagram on kind of how an application works, just a few kind of headline comments. The best way, well, first of all, there are a number of different technologies that can best be described in a loose sense as distributed ledger technologies, which self-identify as blockchains, which makes a kind of a universal definition a little bit difficult. There is no single one, the blockchain. Just as in the early days of the internet, there were multiple different intranets, but there was no singular the internet, even though you often hear people talk about blockchain or the blockchain. What you essentially have are different networks which can exist and look very different from one another. So, for example, the public blockchains which are used to host cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ether are very different than the Hyperledger family of blockchains that have been developed by Linux Foundation and others, IBM, et cetera, to solve different applications or to fit different needs. So as a result, let me kind of zoom out and be a little philosophical about this and say that blockchains or distributed ledger technologies as such should best be thought of as just a collection of different algorithms which added together basically create a consensus protocol for how different nodes in a system might agree on what information exists in that system and how they can agree on when that information changes. So it allows a distributed network to come to a consensus on the state of the network at any given time. The way it does that is it uses cryptography on the one hand as the actual mechanism, and it uses economic incentives as sort of the social mechanism to ensure that all of the nodes or a majority of nodes in this network are committed to accuracy and work to prevent abuse of this network. So as I noted, all blockchains are distributed ledger technologies. By nature of being distributed, they do not have a central authority like a bank or a land registry, which keeps keeps centralized the information relevant to that system or transactions in that system, and which is the ultimate arbiter of truth or the ultimate arbiter of the state of the network, it should be said. That's how it works with banking. When I log in and look at my account, I don't actually have a node which is helping to update the status of my account. My screen when I log into my Wells Fargo account is simply reflecting what the bank as a central entity is pushing out to me in terms of the state of the network, in this case, the state of my bank account. It works differently in blockchains or distributed ledger technologies. All blockchains involve computational nodes, which are sometimes also known as peers, that are operated by participants in the network. Each one of these nodes, backed by a participant, and a node simply being let's say a grouping of computational capacity, like a computer or a supercomputer or what have you, that is committed to working within the network. It commits some of its computational capacity to the network. Each one of those nodes owns a copy, a duplicate redundant copy of the state of the network. In this case, let's call that the ledger, the shared ledger. So think of it as a ledger in an energy market context or in a cryptocurrency context. Think of it as a ledger of all the transactions which have taken place. And when you have a list of all the transactions which have taken place, you have information on who owns what at what time. So you have insight into the state of the network at that particular time. There are two more fundamental concepts which are very important to this. Transactions, which I was just discussing, and then smart contracts. So a smart contract is something which is essentially, think of it as a very formal way of saying an if-then statement. It is a contingent contract, which is pre-designed, pre-programmed to execute under, or to self-execute under certain conditions that can be triggered. So imagine I say, I already write a contract that says anytime in the next 2 years, if oil hits more than $100 a barrel, I commit to purchasing X many amount of futures or selling X many amount of futures in a market. That's an example of a smart contract, which I pre-program. I don't make the decision when oil reaches $100 a barrel. The decision's already been made. It's been pre-programmed. The idea here being why are smart contracts important in this context instead of others? It is relatively easy and easier than in the existing frameworks we have for electricity transactions or for monetary transactions to include smart contracts, to include these formal, these elegant if-then statements into the transactions themselves or into the shared distributed ledger itself than it would be in other systems as they exist today, in the incumbent networks and systems that we use today. So before I go any deeper, now why don't we take a look at the diagram that we have up on the slide, how a blockchain network records a transaction. And I'll just walk through it very briefly. Essentially, let's say that I have 100. We'll use Bitcoin as an example, just because it's a cryptocurrency which everyone has at least heard of, if not intimately familiar with. Everyone's at least aware of it. So I have some Bitcoin and I want to pass it to Patricio to thank him for organizing this webinar. He might request a transaction from me, or I might request a transaction sending him 100 Bitcoin, for example. That request, that requested movement of asset is essentially that requested change in the state of the system is sent to a network of nodes, and they receive it without knowing at all whether that's legitimate. Do I exist as an entity in this network? Does Patricio exist as an entity in this network? Do we each have accounts? And do I have enough in my account to send to his account? Or do I only have 50 Bitcoin? Or do I have 0 Bitcoin? In which case that transaction should be rejected. So the network of nodes works to essentially validate the requested change in the state of the system that I have submitted. The way it does that is by solving a whole series of different puzzles. It's essentially a bunch of busy work, in essence, in which computers connected to the network are rewarded with newly issued Bitcoin if they're able to solve the puzzle correctly the fastest. These nodes, as a result, are known as miners or mining nodes because the activity of dedicating their computing capacity to solving the puzzle is an activity described as mining, which sounds much more directed than it really is. It's a bit haphazard, in which there's the likelihood of that miner solving the puzzle and successfully mining a new Bitcoin or a new share of a new Bitcoin is pretty much correlated with the computing capacity that it can commit. And so the more computing capacity that a node can commit, the higher the probability it has of successfully solving these equations and being rewarded for committing that computing capacity with a Bitcoin. Therein lies the economic incentive. So once a computer wins, the block is verified, the transaction is verified, and a set of transactions of a given length, depending on the nature of the blockchain or depending on the nature of the distributed ledger that's being used, a bunch of transactions which have been validated are grouped together and then are added to the ledger or to the blockchain. The name is exactly what it suggests. It is a chain or a ledger, a long list of a series of different transaction blocks in which in every single block you can see the nature of the network changing. You can see assets changing hands. basically the state of the network changes with each series of blocks which is added to the existing blockchain. A few things to emphasize here, though you probably have already heard them being discussed before or touted as attributes of blockchain, is that if all goes as it should, theoretically, there is no way for a errant block to be added to the blockchain unless more than 50% of the nodes in the network were to be maliciously controlled. In any large distributed ledger with a high number of different nodes controlled by different entities, this is very difficult to achieve because you have so much aggregate computing power, computing capacity involved in the network, and so it would be very difficult to control 50% plus of those. Though this becomes more of an issue in smaller networks, and for that reason, smaller networks tend to be permissioned networks or consortium networks, which I'll get into in just a second. So in addition to that, a few other attributes, the block once added to the blockchain is permanent and unalterable. It is sometimes you hear it described as immutable. This means that should there be an error, if you want to go back and fix something or append or amend something which has already taken place, it cannot be done by, like an Excel file, let's say, deleting a cell and then rewriting over it with the new value. Let's say you wrote 81 and you meant to write 80. That does not work. What you have to do is you have to add a new transaction or a new change in the status of the network to the blockchain, which goes on top of everything else and says, oh, go back down, see block 36 from 5 weeks ago. Hereby it is now meant to be this new value. But the key thing there is that you can, the previous errant transaction or addition to the blockchain is not erased. It's simply being corrected through an addendum. So that's an important aspect of this in terms of maintaining the integrity of and transparency of the entire record of transactions, not only what actually took place, but what was submitted to the blockchain throughout its entire history. Now let me just briefly cover, because I mentioned it, the three categories of blockchain. It's best to think of three broad categories of blockchain. One is the one that everyone is most familiar with, that's a public blockchain. That's what sits behind familiar cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, Ether, and Litecoin and similar cryptocurrencies. It is public in the sense that anyone can be a node if they have computing power. Anyone can be a participant if they just set up a wallet or an account that allows them to store the unit of value on that particular blockchain or in that particular distributed ledger. And the benefits of this are that by making it public and open, you crowd in much more computing capacity, which means that you have increased speed of exchange. You have increased computing power sitting behind the network. And thus, as a result, you can reduce perhaps some of the fees involved in incenting those nodes to solve for problems, because there's so much competition to solve for those problems. So as you get increased supply of computing capacity, you theoretically should get lower costs of recruiting that computing capacity, which results in lower fees per transaction in executing them. The second form of blockchain is on the far other end of the spectrum is a private blockchain. This is one that would operate very, very similar actually to today's, let's say, banking system, in which you'd have a single owner of the blockchain or the distributed ledger. Let's say it's a bank like Wells Fargo. You would have greater standardization, and the bank would control who is allowed to participate, and it would probably offer or underwrite the computational needs of running that network entirely from that central entity. It might do it through multiple nodes which are owned by that central entity, but the key thing here is that to maintain the private control, you can't have other nodes participating that aren't owned by the central authority. The middle ground is a consortium blockchain. A consortium blockchain is managed by members, designated members. So this is how many of the blockchains being developed by the Energy Web Foundation work. in that you have, let's say, multiple utilities or multiple energy retailers all operating within the same market, who are they all commit to maintaining the network for the maintaining the blockchain for the benefit of using it for that market in which they all participate. And then the members who manage that blockchain would agree upon who is a permissioned participant and who is not. In this case, maybe it is only those with meters, so those essentially households would be permission to participate. That would exclude those that are not actually consuming electricity, or those that are exclude those that are not actually producing electricity, for example. That's a way in which you might run an energy market, not from a single centralized authority in a slightly decentralized manner, but one which is still controlled more than a public blockchain is. So with that, let me just take a deep breath and allow Patricia to follow up with a few additional questions on that, because we just covered a lot. Some of this can be a little bit complex, and I want to make sure that we answer any initial questions that some of the participants might have.
Definitely, that's been very helpful. Good overview. Going a little bit further, we haven't talked much about the actual mechanics of the technology or the code underlying the mining activity to create and validate these blocks, which I don't think is necessarily a negative thing. I don't understand how the internet works, but we use it constantly. So my question to you is, how far into the weeds on this technology do you think state officials need to be?
It's a very good question, and I think that a lot of people do get hung up on that. They, like you noted, we don't know, how email really works or how the internet really works, and yet we depend on it every day, just intuitively without thinking. But a lot of people get very hung up on okay, walk me through exactly how all these different computers know that I'm not just spoofing them, or I'm not just submitting a false transaction. The answer to that is too complex to focus the rest of this webinar on, because it gets into cryptography, computer science, and areas which basically I, nor probably most, or all of those on the call, are not really qualified to comment on. What I'll say is that for those interested in further reading, the cryptographic system which is being used to underpin the validation process, the quote-unquote puzzle-solving process of the nodes when they're trying to validate a transaction or add a block to the blockchain, that cryptographic process is known as a Merkle tree. Not Angela Merkel, but it's named after a cryptographic process called a Merkle tree, in which it's basically solving against multiple different signatures and hashes that the participants in the transaction have each submitted, along with details of the transaction itself. So those that are interested in that can go Google Merkle tree, read much more about it. And those that are interested in what are its benefits, what are its vulnerabilities, etc. The thing I would say is that for those working on this from a policy perspective, or obviously from those state officials on the call that are thinking about this in terms of what governor's offices, what state regulatory authorities should be thinking about and asking, it's important to understand what's the design of the blockchain. First of all, as I emphasized at the beginning of the call, there's no such thing as the blockchain, nor are all blockchains designed similarly. There are design choices. So first of all, it's important to understand whether it is a public blockchain, a private blockchain, or a consortium blockchain. Another key fundamental feature, which is important to ask about, but we didn't really cover yet, and it's probably not worth going into too much on this call, but another key design feature is, what is the consensus protocol? I highlighted one method of consensus in which it's called proof of work, and it's where all of the different nodes go out and try and solve problems, puzzles. And once they think they found a solution, they demonstrate their proof of work. They walk through their steps and show their proof of work to all the rest of the nodes, and then all the rest of the nodes see if they agree with that. And if there's agreement amongst all the nodes that yes, this is a legitimate solution to the puzzle, that node is rewarded some fiscal and monetary incentive, and the block is validated. There are other consensus protocols which exist. In many cases, they have become popularized, or they are being worked on because of how energy intensive the proof of work consensus protocol has become, particularly in very popular large public blockchains such as those behind Bitcoin or the Ethereum network. You all have probably read at least a headline talking about the vampire-like nature of the electricity demand of running the Bitcoin network or running the Ethereum network. That much of that is wrapped up in the choice of consensus protocol that is used. And so for that.
Okay, so shifting tracks a bit then, when we hear about blockchain's use in the energy sector, it's looking beyond cryptocurrencies and instead focusing on this ability to facilitate transactions without the need for intermediaries. This still feels pretty abstract. What are some of the practical or promising use cases in the energy sector? Are there pilots, for example, that you could point to as particularly compelling? Hey, David, do we still have you?
Hello?
Yes. I think we lost you for a second, but we're back.
Call looks like it just dropped. Apologize for that. I'll try and pick up where I was and just wrap it up quickly, but it is to say that there are alternative consensus protocols other than proof of work, which a blockchain network could employ. These involve proof of elapsed time, proof of stake, in addition to proof of work, and there are others which are being developed as well. They each have their benefits and their drawbacks, and one might be appropriate for a particular type of network or for a particular use case, but inappropriate for many others. There's not yet a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. It is a design choice, and I think that's important to emphasize. And that's important for regulators to ask about or policymakers to think about, is if they're looking at any particular solution or something being a service being peddled by a provider or a company, they need to understand more about the design of the blockchain network in terms of, is it public, private, or consortium? What is the consensus protocol being used? And then once you know those things, you have enough information to go and to research, are the claims being made verified, or at least are they consistent with what we've seen in empirical evidence so far? Everyone knows that though the Bitcoin blockchain might be immutable and secure, some of the accounts which have been used to store, some of the wallets or accounts which have been used to store Bitcoin are not entirely secure. There have been instances of them being hacked. Why is that? That's an important question for regulators to ask, to look at, okay, what was the potential vulnerability or weakness in that part of the system? And does it exist in the solution or in the model or in the business service which is being proposed by a company or by a solution provider? So I think that's hopefully at least a shorthand summary way of articulating how you might think through being smart, not knowing enough questions to ask so as to not be fooled by things without having to dig down deep into all the technical computer science details of what's going on within various different distributed ledger networks.
No, that's helpful. And I mentioned this before, but I think it might have gotten lost when your call dropped. But shifting a little bit to sort of the practical applications. Often when we hear about blockchain's use in the energy sector, it's still a fairly abstract concept of facilitating transactions without the need for intermediaries. So on the practical note, are there some promising use cases in the energy sector or pilot examples that you find particularly compelling that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the study we did, looking at a broad swath of initiatives, and I'll show that. Let me talk about both the geographic distribution as well as the distribution by application type. So geographically, unsurprisingly, we found that the majority of the initiatives which are taking place thus far are concentrated in Western Europe and North America. Within Western Europe, the true leaders in this space are the UK, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Those markets in particular have shown leadership, both in terms of the volume of in blockchain initiatives which are taking place, as well as the relative sophistication or the depth to which they're engaging within or engaging with incumbent authorities, whether that be EPECs like wholesale market operators or regulators, or working within, in the case of the UK, let's say, a regulatory sandbox scheme which has been set up by Ofgem, the electricity network regulator. So that's the picture for Western Europe and the United States. A lot of this is obviously delineated by the opportunities afforded by different state energy markets. We've seen more activity in deregulated markets than in regulated markets. That should surprise no one. Particularly in Texas, where you have a competitive retail market, there's additional activity and different business models that work there, but do not necessarily work in other markets. There's also a fair amount of activity going on in Australia, to a lesser degree in Asia, in China. In China, there are a handful of startups. There's only one or two in India that we were able to find. And in Japan, you actually have an incumbent utility, TEPCO, that's still trying to kind of find its new strategy and find new sources of competitive advantage after dealing with the fallout of the Fukushima disaster. TEPCO is readily embracing a kind of corporate venture capital model to try and get exposure to blockchain technology today. So with that geographic overview being done, let's move on really quickly to the application composition that we found in terms of these blockchain initiatives. And I should note that although this is a fast-moving space, and surely by next year already there will be many, many more initiatives that will have entered into this space, at least for right now, I've seen a number of different attempts being made to catalog the density of various different applications, blockchain and energy applications being explored in the electricity sector, and most of them look very, very similar to this pie chart. So this is true, at least in terms of direction of travel, and I think that's the best way to think about it. The big thing that comes across here is that the overwhelming plurality of applications are in electricity trading markets, as we call them, essentially helping to facilitate transactions, helping to make markets more efficient in the existing pure commodity electricity markets. So that means not involved in environmental attributes or renewable energy credits or sidecar markets which sit alongside the primary commodity of electricity. But this is really the majority of applications or initiatives thus far are focused on facilitating the core electricity transaction. Now, the majority of them are actually focused on facilitating something which we, the authors, think is fairly far off and is not realistic in the near term, which are peer-to-peer transactions of energy. So disintermediating a utility or a central authority, a distribution market manager entirely, and just having a peer-to-peer market in which when I am generating excess solar electricity, I don't sell it back to the utility, which then sells it back to my neighbor, but I sell it to my neighbor directly. This sounds appealing when written up in the white papers of some of these startups, and when written up in different articles as an ultimate goal of where we might want to go, but it suffers from a number of flaws, not least of which is that our electricity networks have some key security needs, have some key cost minimization needs, which are absolutely the interest of governments, of local governments, of state governments, and ultimately of the federal government. And as such, a system which was managed exclusively by the nodes would suffer from a number of drawbacks we can get into later, including the fact that you would need to broadcast the state of the grid broadly to those nodes in a way which would raise security concerns. It's difficult to know what sort of entity would impose security constraints or least cost constraints on that entire system, and tell, let's say, or invalidate or not allow a peer-to-peer transaction, which might look good for both of those participants in that transaction, but which might not be good or beneficial or optimal for the broader network or system as a whole. So here's where you get a little bit of tension, and we think that there are a number of regulatory as well as just logical market barriers to peer-to-peer transactions. Nonetheless, that's where you see a majority of the activity right now. Something which is, I think, more promising and as seeing the second most attention from blockchain startups and initiatives is grid transactions. This is what we use to describe transactions being facilitated through a traditional distribution utility model. And here there are significant efficiencies to, let's say just more easily recording the generation of electricity from a homeowner, which is sold back to a utility, and reporting at exactly at what time it was generated, making sure that it receives fair value based on that excess electricity generation's value to the grid at that moment. Blockchain offers a number of potential benefits from that perspective. Other categories include energy financing. So using, let's say, initial coin offerings or using tokens in order to raise funds for an activity in the energy sector. Let's say it might be rooftop solar development. And so allowing individuals to, or allowing firms which want to develop rooftop solar to crowdfund investments and to sell micro shares of a rooftop panel or a particular tranche of generation over a period of time in a way that might be more easily facilitated using a distributed ledger, using blockchain technology. Another one which occupies 11%, but which we think is one of the most promising applications in the short term. This is one that matters for regulators and that we think is eminently achievable and offers real logic for the involvement of blockchain technology, is sustainability attribution. Sustainability attribution is a broad term for those technologies which are, for those markets which might involve carbon credits, renewable energy credits, renewable obligation credits, whatever you might want to call them, but markets which are oftentimes created by policymakers in order to encourage a particular attribute in the energy market. It might be low carbon, it might be quote unquote clean energy, it might be quote unquote renewable energy, whatever it might be. We see renewable portfolio standards and other policy types which have created a new asset class, a new credit type, which sits alongside the primary commodity of electricity. And here in the United States, as many of those on the call will be familiar with, there are more than 10 largely very balkanized and incongruent renewable energy credit markets. And so this creates a barrier to promoting additional renewables investment if it's very difficult for an entity to get certified as one that can participate in those renewable energy credit markets, perhaps selling them, generating them, buying them, trading them. And then it's even more difficult to trade across boundaries. Most of these markets are operated by clunky and antiquated software, which is offered by a single vendor across most of the United States. At the very least, there are no more than 2 or 3 vendors that really matter across the United States. And so implementing a blockchain-based system in which renewable energy generation automatically also generated at the same moment a credit that had on the that had on that credit all of the information automatically transcribed that's relevant for its value as a renewable energy credit. What was the generation source? Where was it generated? What time was it generated? Where did it go? Who was it sold to? And then that information, all of that sustainability attribute information would travel with the credit every time it changed hands. That's a much more sophisticated system and a potentially much more low-cost system that is currently being used today. So we believe that there are major opportunities here, and it will either take one of 2 routes. Either the incumbent software provider will begin adopting and exploring blockchain technology to offer via its existing contracts with state regulators to run these markets, or regional regulators to run these markets, or a new service provider will enter the space which uses a blockchain-based system to do this, and which will demonstrate better performance than the incumbent software provider. That's something to watch in this space. Just very quickly, the other two categories that we identified: electric vehicle charging. There are a number of compelling opportunities here for automating the differential pricing across time, differential pricing across geography for electric vehicle charging through a blockchain-based system. And in the others category, there's a whole range of different applications. Cybersecurity of the grid, that's one application. Another one might be just asset identification and asset recording. So for example, every utility has a asset registry typically for everything from its substations to its repair trucks, to different distribution and transmission lines, to generators that it might own. And those tend to be proprietary asset registries, which are kept close to the utility because it's considered competitive information. But what happens if you have wildfires in Idaho or Oregon or Montana or California, and you want utilities in the same service region or in contiguous service regions to communicate with one another about the state of their assets at a given point in time? Right now that can be done, but it's done manually. But imagine if you could just pre-program smart contracts to reveal under, let's say, what a government declared state of emergency or some other pre-specified trigger, it would reveal certain information to each utility automatically about the state of its assets. And that could be done in a way which maximizes the public benefit for emergency response while still protecting competitive information for those utilities. I think that others category is set to grow because I think that the asset registry, the cybersecurity applications are not the main primary interest of startups in this space, but they will ultimately be the primary interest of incumbent utilities as well as regulators in this space. And so those that we put in the others category are set to grow significantly.
Thanks. This breakdown is interesting. But to be clear, aren't there like other systems or technologies that can do these things already? And if they do exist, sort of what makes blockchain better, I guess?
Yeah, that is a terrific question, and one which is frankly not asked enough. There's someone I've been working with on potentially a follow-up paper to this, and the way he likes to describe it, which I like, is that there's a grand trade-off here. That in order to get some of the positive attributes of blockchain-based systems or distributed ledger technologies, you need to sacrifice a few things. One of those is efficiency. So there are already distributed networks today that solve problems or that maintain registries or help record information. But those today engage in something called parallel computing, in which all of the different nodes work on solving different parts of the same problem, so that you're harnessing all of the computing capacity in a way that isn't duplicative, so that you're solving problems using your computing capacity, distributed computing capacity available in a way that maximizes the ultimate speed and efficiency of the system. In a blockchain-based network, a distributed ledger network, it's worth recognizing that computing capacity is being utilized in a completely redundant manner rather than a complementary manner. And so you have, you have one miner that's going to win whenever you're trying to validate a transaction. But imagine all the computing capacity that is quote unquote wasted or shed or not used for useful purposes by all of the other miners that were working on solving this problem, but which did not ultimately solve it as quickly as the winning miner did. This is an example of a mass, at least in the abstract on paper, a mass waste of efficiency of computing capacity, et cetera. As a result, this gets to the second element of the grand trade-off, which is scalability. Resource inefficiency affects the cost effectiveness of the blockchain platform, but perhaps more importantly, it limits its ability to scale. Because peer nodes have to hold copies of the entire transaction ledger, that means that the greater that the ledger grows, the fewer nodes are capable of participating as peers in that network, because more and more of their own capacity has to be committed to keeping a copy of this ever-growing transaction ledger. So as a result, as networks get bigger, like Bitcoin or Ethereum have gotten, it only allows participation by the nodes that have the greatest resources available to them in terms of memory and computational capacity. Now, there are potential workarounds to this, but it is an important challenge or obstacle that we have to identify. Some of those solutions that are being experimented with include only having some nodes which keep entire copies of the entire transaction ledger, while other nodes might keep only the last month's worth or only the last week's worth. And other nodes might be computational nodes only and might not serve as quote unquote, memory nodes with any copy of the transaction or any copy of the blockchain ledger. There are going to be trade-offs in cost to each of these. And so the point being is that the benefits of blockchain as oftentimes very poetically articulated at the high level or the abstract, start to fall apart when you see some of the compromises that have to be made to accommodate the fact that this is a very inefficient way of harnessing computing capacity. Has benefits, but it suffers from great inefficiency. Very briefly, I'll mention just a few other trade-offs here. One is that the inability to alter the blockchain ledger, its immutability, in other words, dramatically amplifies the risks of mistaken or faulty transactions. This is particularly relevant when we think about one of the greatest challenges in applying blockchain to the electricity sector, which is accurately translating the physical world onto the digital ledger. So even though the information once on a blockchain might be secure and immutable and unable to be changed, if I am recording, let's say, the methane leakage rate associated with a unit of gas production, or the time of day at which a unit of solar electricity was generated, and my remote sensor, my actual little meter or sensor, is inaccurately recording and then transcribing that information onto the blockchain, it might be secure once on the blockchain, but it's inaccurate information, which is now secure and immutable. And so we have to be very careful about kind of what aspect of the system is secure and what aspect of the system is vulnerable to all the same problems that we have with existing systems that rely on remote sensors or other ways to translate the physical world into the digital world. So the physical digital interface there is another one to be aware of, which offers blockchain offers no real improvement on that versus an incumbent system which is being used. So as a result of all this, and let me illustrate one other thing as well, which is just that particularly when it comes to distribution level transactions, so household transactions or anything other than the largest electricity transactions that are frequent, let alone those that might involve, let's say, a smart thermostat within a home or demand side response, where you might have multiple different microtransactions every second, and then you scale that up by houses, and now you're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions to tens or hundreds of millions of microtransactions occurring every second. You need to be able to recruit a vast amount of computing capacity to do that. There was a pilot study done with, and I'm only going to get the basics right here, so I don't have all the exact specifics off the top of my head, but there's a pilot project done with about 50 nodes in a network, let's say producers and consumers of electricity in a simulated network. And a very simple blockchain-based system was used to just do a simple optimal power flow calculation for that network of 50 nodes. This is something that happens on the grid, all the time on a daily basis. You have optimal power flow calculations being done, obviously, currently by central authorities. In this blockchain-based pilot or experiment, it took about 3 minutes just to calculate optimal power flow for those 50 different nodes in the system, and that's obviously far too long than what we need in reality. And so you can imagine that aspect of things, some of the security constrained power flow dynamics, optimal power flow calculations, et cetera, some of the things which have to take place on the grid but aren't as sexy as selling electricity from one neighbor to another, might not be left to blockchain-based systems, but might be left to more incumbent systems. And blockchain might play a role just in certain niches or certain very specific elements of the overall electricity system. And I think that's the most realistic vision of probably where this is going in the future.
That's helpful, and all those examples make it much more tangible. Honestly, I still don't fully understand the underlying technology, but I do think I have a better sense of how it's used and its potential value. But skipping ahead a little bit and just trying to be conscious of time now, how do you think policymakers and regulators, particularly at the state level, how should they be approaching this technology? And are there any state examples you would highlight as a best practice?
Yeah, let me give you just a couple state examples first, and then I'll give you my kind of takeaways for recommendations. So on July 16th of this year, the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is the Public Utility Commission for Arizona, became the first to open a regulatory document which is examining potential applications of blockchain technology in the energy industry. That came from Commissioner Andy Tobin, who incidentally has also authored a Arizona Energy Modernization Plan, which sets a potential 80% clean energy target for 2050. So this is about, thinking what role blockchain plays in a state which already might be going towards a more diverse orchestra of both large generation sources like the Palo Verde plant there, which is the largest nuclear generator in the United States, as well as a whole bunch of rooftop solar, distributed energy storage, batteries, et cetera. Now, this is a very, this docket is probably not, the gold standard of, where we hope states are in 5 or 10 years, but it's a good starting point. It basically allows service providers, universities, and others to come forward with their particular pitches on how the state should be thinking about blockchain, how the PUC should be implementing it or think about implementing it, if there are regulations which would be problematic or create a roadblock for some of the more promising applications here. So it's an information forcing docket is the way to think about it, but it's worth looking at by other state regulators. Another example, another approach being taken is the Illinois Department of Innovation Technology, I believe it's called, recently formed an Illinois blockchain initiative, which is studying applications of blockchain technology for government services across sectors, so not just within the energy sector. It has 5 different pilot programs. 1 is property deed recording. 2 is validating academic credentials. 3 is a single statewide health provider registry that would use a distributed ledger. 4 is securing vital records, including birth certificates. And 5, the one of interest to us in energy, is creating a renewable energy credit marketplace. This goes along with one of the applications that I highlighted earlier in the talk. So the renewable energy credit marketplace is being worked on in conjunction with the Illinois Pollution Control Board. And the overall goal is to create an electronic credit system for renewable resources in which you record, monitor, and trade, green energy certificates that would accompany the generation of renewable electricity, but then could be spliced off that renewable electricity and traded within green attribute markets, green credit markets, just like any other renewable portfolio standard that we see today. In addition to that, something called the Clean Energy Blockchain Network in Illinois is installing solar and storage-powered electric vehicle charging and energy storage stations in Evanston, Illinois. And they're basically working with a number of other groups, including Illinois regulators, including the Clean Energy Group and the Resilient Power Project, to develop these stations. And what they hope is that once they're developed, electric vehicle owners will be able to recharge their car batteries, and then the excess solar power, which is not needed for electric vehicle charging, will be distributed to low-income housing units in a nearby community for nothing more than the cost of the transmission. And it'll record data from each of those transactions onto a permissioned blockchain or a consortium blockchain. And it's hoping that by doing this, it'll basically reduce the costs for electric vehicle charging, and it'll reduce the cost for provision of that excess electricity to low-income homeowners. And so you'll get great data on the experiment that'll be recorded on the blockchain, and they hope that it'll ultimately reduce low-income homeowners' energy bills as well. So that's one example as well that's worth looking at. Finally, I'll note that here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, there was a little bit of excitement over the summer when in late August, the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources held a full committee hearing to explore blockchain's potential for energy efficiency and for cybersecurity. This was a very kind of high-level, early-stage investigation by policymakers, the majority of whom, both senators and Senate staff, don't know that much about this space, and so kind of the quality of the discussion and the quality of the questions was relatively early stage, as you might imagine. But there was some good discussion of the trade-offs between different consensus protocols like proof of authority, proof of stake, proof of work, et cetera, something that I highlighted earlier. And much of that discussion focused on the energy use of blockchain, which is only one element here, but I think it's more interesting to focus on where it is appropriate in the electricity system and where it is not. In terms of recommendations, let me wrap this up and get some questions from folks by just mentioning three key recommendations. Number one, it's important to just invest in understanding blockchain and its regulatory intersections. This is worth, it is worth sending, let's say, PUC staff or governor staff to some blockchain and energy conferences. I actually met the staffer for Commissioner Andy Tobin completely by happenstance at a recent blockchain and energy conference organized by Green Tech Media in San Francisco. And I think these are underrated opportunities for just a frank kind of on the sidelines, informal conversation and learning opportunity between startups, between incumbent players like utilities and incumbent energy companies, and then regulatory staff. So I think that's one way that that there can be investment in understanding this. There could also be government could play a role in standardization of the terminology that's in this space, so that you can better, startups could better benefit by where they are allowed to, let's say, play, and where they might run into actually some regulatory barriers. So specific concepts like peer-to-peer trading or transactive energy, it would actually be useful for regulators to try and step in and help to define what these terms are, what they are not, to bring a little bit of order to this still quite unstructured space, particularly for the blockchain startups out there. Recommendation number two is to support the development of actual standards in terms of system standards, particularly for how data is used, what customer data can and can't be attached to, let's say, transaction information that goes on a blockchain, whether there's a distinction between full anonymization and pseudonymization, with pseudonymization essentially being what is achieved on most blockchain networks, where I might have the identity of a string of letter and numbers, but that string of letter and numbers might be reused again and again and again. And so my pseudonym is out there and being reused and is identifiable and potentially trackable in identifying the transactions I'm involved in. Slightly different than true anonymization. This might be less relevant today in the US context, but it's certainly relevant in Europe, where this debate over anonymization, pseudonymization, and how personal information is recorded on blockchains, which are then theoretically non-deletable and immutable and therefore, for all eternity, how that intersects with new data privacy regulations like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was put in place by the European Commission in May of this year. The final recommendation I have, number three, is that states should consider, or local regulators should consider, regulatory sandboxes to enable demonstration projects. These sandboxes should be set up so that distribution utilities can try new things, but also to allow projects without any direct utility involvement. And a key feature of sandboxes should also be that they involve regulators and they encourage a more dynamic exchange of information between regulators and startups and utilities that are interested in pilot projects. And this might not even involve changing regulations, so it shouldn't be seen as a deregulatory move, regulatory sandbox, as much as just a window that startups and that innovators can go to. So there's one great example, the regulatory sandbox in the UK that I mentioned earlier. There's a terrific example where a startup went to that regulator, to the regulatory sandbox at Ofgem, and kind of said, hey, we're looking to get financing from a bank, but the bank is a little bit uncertain about exactly how we would be considered, or just what the regulator's understanding is of what we are in terms of this electricity market, and that creates some risk and uncertainty. So they were able to get a letter back from the regulator saying, for as you describe this project XYZ, you would be understood to be this entity within these electricity market regulations. The startup or the innovator could then take that to the bank and say, okay, with this letter of understanding from the regulator, it's now easier to actually get financing, get debt, get additional credit from a financial institution with that common understanding, just a simple letter between the regulator and the innovator. So that's another example of how these regulatory sandboxes could work and some of the value that they could bring.
Quickly pulling in a question from the audience, beyond Illinois, are there any other states that you would point to as particular leaders in developing different blockchain initiatives? I know that Delaware has an initiative, Wyoming has been pretty active, Arkansas as well. I don't know if there are any others you might want to add to that group.
Definitely, those are all great examples. New York is also starting to look at this in the context of its Reforming Energy Vision project. In Florida and in Orlando in particular, there's a lot of interest in this space, so look at Orlando. And then finally, I would mention that in California, there's some work being done by utilities there, including PG&E, working with the regulator to see if blockchain-based systems might be most appropriate for, let's say, the generation and management of low carbon fuel credits or electric fuel credits within California's low carbon fuel standard market when PG&E sells electricity to an electric vehicle, let's say, plugged into a home. So the electric fuel is both, the electricity it sells is both relevant to the power market in California, but it's also relevant to this very interesting low carbon fuel standard market, which California has set up to encourage everything from electricity as a fuel all the way to animal fat biofuels and alcohol-based biofuels and and trash-based biofuels and everything in between. So you have a whole litany of different low-carbon fuels which are playing in a transportation sector policy, but which are still a potential significant revenue opportunity for PG&E. But it wants a way to manage that and generate those credits and keep track of those credits for compliance purposes in as low cost and most effective a way possible. And so it's worth looking at what utilities in California are doing with blockchain as well.
We're running up on time. As a final thought from you, David, what questions do you think state officials should be asking with respect to blockchain?
I mean, first of all, I think they need to think logically about what is the ultimate end state of this if it scales. So let's say it's for a renewable energy credit market, or let's say it's for peer-to-peer trading or something like that. Is it even worth going down the road of trying something out if the protocols being used or the design of the blockchain is such that as soon as this were to scale to, let's say, 1,000 units, 1,000 households, 1,000 nodes, the computational burden would simply be too much given what needs to be done in this particular context. So, it's important to really think about how good is the fit between the design of the blockchain system, the computational capacity required, and the scale of the market or the scale of the application which is being, attacked. Secondly, I think it is really important to recognize that applications and technologies and the algorithms that are being offered here are going to evolve rapidly. And so more important than looking at blockchain and taking a snapshot vis-a-vis my paper or this webinar and saying, well, here's what blockchain is and here's what it always will be, it's important to understand this as an evolving set of technologies, an evolving set of basically computer science, which is going to evolve in line with a number of other things, and say, how do we keep track of that over time, and how do we maintain a conversation over time between innovators and regulators? That's why I believe that these regulatory sandbox setups allow for a window through which that conversation can take place, because that's very important. you know, the equivalent, the other side of things, which I would highly discourage, is the equivalent of looking at the internet in like the late 1990s, when you had the equivalent of, you know, GeoCities sites, and that's what websites looked like, and they would load, and it took 20 minutes for a single website to load, and you'd have this clunky music come on and everything else. Looking at that and saying, well, this is what the internet is. So I don't know, you know, now let's think through how we might want to regulate e-commerce, right? Rather than understanding that could eventually evolve into the Amazons and the Alibabas, et cetera, of today. So you know, the most important thing, I think, is to get the regulatory structures right, so that you first have a dialogue and you can collect more information over time.
I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Thank you, David, for being with us and for the great conversation. And thank you to the participants for listening in. If anyone has any follow-up questions or would like to be connected with David, feel free to shoot me an email. My email address is right there on the screen. It's pportillo@nga.org. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.